Have you ever had one of those moments when someone comes to you and you know they're about to ask you for something completely unreasonable? It's going to be ridiculously unreasonable what they're about to ask you for. In my house, it usually starts like this. This is what it sounds like when it's going to be unreasonable. Dad, I know that word in that way means what's about to be asked for is it's going to be unreasonable. Or it sounds like this in my house. Babe, it's the same intonation. The intonation is the thing that gives it away. In fact, if I'm in the office and I hear, Stu, I know that I'm about to be asked something completely unreasonable, usually by Glenn. Now, I'm sat at home the other day, Julie and I were sat in the lounge, and one of our children walks into the lounge, and they start with, Dad, and I thought, whatever this is, it's about to cost me significant money. Just the use of that word in that way. I said, yeah, what is it? The dog, well, you know, as soon as the dog's brought into it early, someone else is to blame. But let's get the dog involved. The dog's eaten my phone. I'm like, right. Can you buy me a new smartphone? Just at that moment, I said, well, mate, we gotta think about that a little bit, just gotta do that. So let's see the phone. So the evidence of the phone arrives. The dog hadn't swallowed the phone. He'd just had a good chew on it for a little while. We have a Labrador retriever. The idea of chewing a phone is like one of the highlights of his year. He's like, this is awesome. And there's bits of phone comes in, and you're thinking to yourself, I can rebuild this. As opposed to the hundreds of pounds it costs to replace, I can rebuild. So this is not going to happen. This is not going to happen. This is an unreasonable request. If you go upstairs to your mum's bedside drawer, in that you're going to find a Nokia. Go and use that for a little while. When's your contract due? So those kind of unreasonable requests, they come our way. But sometimes we make them the other way as well. And usually in our house, unreasonable requests begin like this. Go and tidy your room. That phrase just by itself is seen as a completely unreasonable request. What? Well, it's my room. That's true, it is your room. And when you pay for it, you can leave it in the state you want to leave it in. But until then, and I've got an amen. Anybody? Thank you. And until then, deal with your room. But it seems to me, my kids always have friends who don't have to do what I want my kids to do. Do your kids have friends like that as well? You tell them something, and they go, yeah, my friend, name someone that you don't know and you've never heard of. It's never the friend that you've met. It's never the one you can go and talk to and quantify the question. It's always someone that you've never actually heard of that maybe, and I'm not suggesting my children are lying to me, they've completely made up for the moment, but maybe, they tell you about this friend who maybe they've done this or done that, and you think, as adults, we never think to say that, do I? I never think of going to my wife and going, no, babe, I can't do that. My friend Jason, he doesn't do that in his house. So if he doesn't, why should I? We never, because the reason we don't do it is we know we're never going to get away with it. That's the issue. Unreasonable requests come our way in all sorts of ways, shapes, or forms. Sometimes it lands at work. Sometimes it lands in family. Sometimes you think you've made an unreasonable request of yourself. You're in the gym. You think, I can lift that. And then suddenly your body tells you that was an unreasonable request. You thought you could, but you've discovered you can't. And at that point, you're just going, help me. And you need somebody to come and help you out of that situation. Unreasonable requests. But what happens when God makes unreasonable requests in our lives? Because God interacts with us. He doesn't stand afar and wait to see what we do, but God's interested in being involved in the everyday, day-to-day parts of our lives. When I decided that I wanted to be a minister, part of that journey was this. I put some boundaries in place between me and God. Because although I love God, I didn't want him having complete free reign because I was nervous of what he might ask me to do. So a few things I was pretty clear about. I was pretty clear on a few things about countries of the world I didn't want to live in. So I sort of threw those out there and thought, that'll be okay. But there were two things I was abundantly clear on. Number one, I did not want to plant a church, so start a church from scratch. That was number one. And number two, I never wanted to live in central London. Those were the two things that I was super clear with God about. And then, 10 years ago, God speaks to me and says, hey, listen, I've got this great idea for you. I said, yeah, what is it? He says, I want you to plant a church in central London. Off you go. And I'm like, no, God, that is completely unreasonable. I was clear to you. I'll do anything. I'll go anywhere. A few little exceptions. But I'll do anything you want me to do. But don't ask me to plant a church in central London. And God's going, that's fine. I'll talk to your wife. And you know, the process kind of moved on from there when there's a moment. And I kept thinking to myself, God, I gave you all the world to deal with. But you chose the two things that I said I didn't want to do. It kind of gets me. I want to read to you from a part of the Bible we don't often read except at Christmas. So if you got your Bible, why don't you turn to Luke chapter 1. And we're going to read the bit before Jesus arrives in the Christmas narrative. Everybody feeling nice and Christmassy? The weather's, well, it could be like this at Christmas. You never know with our weather anymore, do you? Here we go. Luke chapter 1 and verse 5. In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were upright in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commandments and regulations blamelessly. These are great people. These are good people. They're living good, just, moral, legal lives. They're getting on with doing the best they can with what they have got. And then verse 7 throws this in. But they had no children because Elizabeth was barren and they were both well along in years. Can you imagine as a husband describing your wife as, yeah, we're happily married, but she is well along in years? That's like death. There's death involved in that one sentence there. These are great people that when you look at it, you say, do you know what? They're servants of God. He's a priest. He's doing everything right. But just because he's doing everything right doesn't mean that everything's working out right. And here we are, they're in this situation where they've been unable to have children. And there's a massive stigma attached to that. There is to a degree today, but there was a much greater stigma, especially attached to a lady who was unable to bear children. It's almost like it's shifted her out of sync with society. And she found herself in that position, but they still tried to live right. They still tried to do the right things. They still obeyed God. They still got on with what they were doing. And then it goes like this, verse 8. Once, when Zechariah's division was on duty. So the priest was split into different divisions, and he is in this division of Abijah. He was serving as priest before God, and he was chosen by Lot. Now, Lot's not a person in this case. There is a person called Lot in the Bible, but this is, where his name gets pulled out of the hat. How many maybe had sweepstakes at work or sweepstakes in your family for the World Cup? You reached in, you pulled out Spain, and you went, yes, Spain! Oh. He was chosen by Lot according to the custom of the priesthood to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. This for a priest, this is the highlight of his career. You only get to do it once as a priest in your career. This is the day. He's going right into the central part of the temple and he is going to present the offering to God. That's what he's going to be doing. And when the time came, verse 10, for the burning of the incense came, all the assembled worshippers were praying outside. The odds of Zechariah being chosen that day are 1,371 to 1. The odds of it being him that day are really on the outside edge. They're the kind of odds you could have got for England winning the World Cup. They were really on the outside. You can tell we shoot the VT early in the week, can't you, as well? Harry's still supporting England. Which I guess, you could see that as a heart position or just we should have edited better. He's there, he's on the edge. He finds himself in this place. Now, what you need to know is a few things about being the priest who's going to go in and serve God. There's an item of clothing that you have to wear as the priest, and thank God we don't have to do that anymore, but they did. And they had to wear this long robe, and the robe had two specific things about it that are important for us to know today. Number one, it had bells around the bottom of the robe. And when you walked as the priest, these bells would jingle, and they just tinkle's not the word I'm after. They jingle away, and then they kind of go from there. And then the other thing was this: not only were the bells around the bottom, but there was a rope as well attached to your waist. Now, the reason for the bells was this: God was so all-powerful and almighty that it was possible if you offered the sacrifice wrong, he could kill you. So they had the bells so that they knew you were alive. Because as long as the bells are ringing, you're alive. So, if you stood still for too long, people might think you were dead. So they kind of, even as a priest, you do that thing. You do it with a child, don't you? It's just inbuilt. You pick up a child, you just start swaying. There's something inbuilt in us that does that. Well, the priest would sway just to keep the bells going. Because if you drop down dead, the reason they had the rope was to haul you out. So you're going into this situation where you've got bells to prove you're alive and a rope to get you out if you die. I mean, it's not like, average day at the office. It's not a kind of like, this will be a doddle. He's already slightly tense going into this place. He knows he's got to get the sacrifice right. He knows he's got to work it out. And so he goes in there, jingle, jingle, jingle. And then this is what happens. Verse 11. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. And when Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. I bet he was. He's gone into this darkened room, there's incense burning, there's smoke in the room, and suddenly an angel appears in the room. The bells are now ringing like Billy-O. I mean, it's like a campanologist convention in the room. It is going off. The thing is just, he is startled. He's not kind of stood there and frozen, but actually fear has kicked in. The guy holding the rope is probably thinking, wow, what is he doing in there? Like normally, it's just a gentle swaying, a little bit of bell ringing. But no, I mean, the thing is like ring-a-ding-ding. It is absolutely going off in that place. Do I pull him out? Do I not pull him out? Is he having some kind of fit? I have no idea what is going on in that place. The angel said to him, do not be afraid. Too late, angel. He's already, you know what? Start with that before you even appear. A voice out of nowhere would help. Don't be afraid of what's about to happen. Boom, angel. No, boom, angel is a bad start to do not be afraid. Anybody is going to react and ring the bell at that point. Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to give him the name John. He will be a joy and delight to many. And so it's like, wow, this moment kicks off. Suddenly he hears his prayer's been heard. His prayer's been heard by this angel. Everything is happening. His big highlight of his career has been hijacked by an angel. The bells are ringing. The guy's pulling the rope. He's pulling the rope back. The guy outside is terrified he's going to get dragged into it. It's just everyone outside is wondering what is going on in there. And Zechariah is in the middle of everything when the angel makes this unreasonable ask of him. You're going to have a son. He'll be a joy and delight to you. Many will rejoice because of his birth. He will be great in the sight of the Lord. He's never to take wine or other fermented drink. He'll be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from birth. Many of the people of Israel will he bring back to the Lord their God, and he'll go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, and to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. It is a powerful statement the angel makes about this son that he is going to have. I mean, it's just like, your son is going to be incredible. He is going to be amazing. He is going to be everything you could ever have dreamed of in a child. He is going to be strong. He's going to be filled with the Holy Spirit. He's going to cause the whole nation to turn back to God. Everything is going to change. And all Zechariah, the only phrase he can get out of his mouth is this: how can I be sure of this? There is an angel in front of him making a proclamation about his son, and the best answer he can come up with is, how can I be sure of this? I don't know about you, if you've ever prayed for something that you really want and you want God to give you a sign. That's the kind of sign you're looking for, right? That's the kind of thing. Normally we're like, God, give me a sign. Give me a warm feeling inside. I feel good, and we can kind of live with that. We were once talking to some friends. We were inviting them to move to London to work with us and to be a part of it. And we were having coffee together in Portsmouth, down by the wharf. And when they finished the conversation, they said to us, do you know what? We're going to need God to really give us a sign of what to do. They walked out of that coffee, they turned a corner, and immediately in front of them was a ship that was berthed at the wharf. And on the back of the ship, it said, Faith, London. We're inviting them to London. And then Faith, London. So they kind of went, all right, the writing is literally on the wall of a ship. Right, that's probably a good indicator that this is the right thing to do. We all love the idea that God could do some kind of sign like that. You know, you're praying and, you know, a friend phones you up and says, oh, I want to tell you this is exactly what you're praying about. And, oh, you go, yeah, that's what I need. Zechariah's dreamed of a sign like this. But at the moment that it happens, this unreasonable ask, his best answer is this: how can I be sure of this? How can I be sure? There is an angel dancing on your duvet, Zechariah. What more do you need right now? And then he gets into it, because this is the difficult part. If he'd have been 20 or 30 years younger, he would have accepted this easily. But his life has taken a few turns that he didn't expect it to take. And when your life takes turns you don't expect, it becomes difficult to believe sometimes. Let's be honest. Sometimes it's difficult to trust God when life has taken a turn you didn't see coming. And that's exactly what Zechariah is this. God, how can I be sure? And his next phrase is really clear. I'm an old man, and my wife is well along in years. I'm an old man, and my wife is well along in years. God, I can give you every reason to use somebody else. God is in the business of making unreasonable asks. He's done it all the way through the Bible. I can point to you a guy called Hosea, who God comes to him, and this is God's word to Hosea. Hosea, go and take for yourself an adulterous wife. What? That's unreasonable, God. Sure, you want me to go and take a faithful wife? No, I want you to do this. You can tell this in the story of Moses. Moses is on the backside of the desert, the middle of nowhere, doing anything he wants to, but doing what God wants him to do. When God tells him to go back to the place where he committed murder, go back to that place. You think about Noah in the ark, building this ship. He's never even heard of an ark or a ship. There's no sitting water. There's never been any rain. Noah's like, this is ridiculous. What is this I'm even building? And what is this rain that's coming? It's unreasonable. One of the prophets in the Old Testament, God asked him to lie on his side for a year. Lie on his side for a year. Now, if you're a teenager, that could be the word of the Lord to you, and you would accept it really readily. Which side? Is there a sofa, and have I got TV? I think at that point, there are some people who could deal with it that easily. But in the Old Testament, there's no sofa, there's no TV. Lie on your side for a year, and at the end of that year, God says to him, roll over and go again. There's some unreasonable asks that occur in the Bible that you've got to kind of look and go, wow, God, you really ask some unreasonable stuff of people. This for Zechariah was completely unreasonable. He had 4 great reasons. Number 1 was this: his personal capacity was limited. I'm an old man. Read between the lines, church. He's not talking about his age. He's talking about his capacity. I'm an old man. How we view our capacity to do something is a greater hindrance or strength than how God views your capacity to do something. When God looks at you, he has a view of your capacity that is a true picture. Because none of the stuff of our lives gets in the way of God's view of your capacity in life. When we view our lives and our capacity, the stuff of our lives gets in the way. We can find reasons and excuses for why we don't have the ability to do what it is that God has asked us to do. Zechariah throws that straight in his face. My personal capacity is limited. Not only that, so is my wife's. Do you know what? The words we speak over one another are incredibly powerful. The way we talk to and about each other actually has a great limiting or releasing potential in people's lives. I want to encourage you, speak faith over people's lives. Speak hope. Speak expectancy. Speak great things over people's lives. Expect God to do the bigger. But he spoke it. I can't. And she can't. In fact, they'd even stop praying about it. God's incredible. Because there are some things we prayed about earlier in our lives that God's still in the process of answering. It may be that your faith has been on a journey where you just don't feel I can pray for that anymore. You know, I prayed for it and it didn't happen. I prayed for it and it didn't happen. I prayed for it and it didn't happen. I pray for God to come through in this area of my family. I pray for God to come through in this area of my finance. It hasn't come through yet. Let me tell you, those prayers, they still resound in heaven. Those prayers are still being heard and are still being answered. God is still working. Zechariah and Elizabeth had stopped praying for a son. We know that because they decided their capacity couldn't produce one. So why pray for something that you can't be bothered to think you can do yourself? So they prepared themselves. This is just never going to happen in our lives. Let's stop putting hope in front of ourselves. Because sometimes when you keep lifting hope up and it doesn't happen, it becomes soul destroying. They were living with that. So they decided, you know what? We'll stop hoping. Let me declare to some of you today, there is a hope that God holds for you. There's a hope for some of your families, for some of your children. There's a hope for some of your situations that God still holds for you. You may have said, I can't even pray about that anymore. In fact, I can't even think about that anymore. It's too hard to process how. God is not asking you the how. He is not asking you to answer how. He is asking you to trust him. When we try and answer how, we're limited by our finite minds. When we decide to trust him, we step into the unlimited of God's infinite mind. For some of you, God's reopening doors that have been closed for decades because you said, it can't happen. It'll never turn around. It'll never be better. And God's saying, I've heard your prayers. I heard your prayers when they were full of faith. And those are the prayers that I'm looking to answer. Those are the prayers I'm going to move in. Zechariah stopped praying. His final excuse, as he looked at his life and he examined it, was as simple as this. His hope had died. There's no way. It is just not going to come about. Has God ever made those kind of requests for you? Requests that just seem so far out. God, I can't possibly go there. Requests that seem just so difficult. God, there's no way I'm going to open myself up to that kind of failure, to the possibility of it going wrong. Maybe of me looking incredibly foolish in the midst of it. I'm not going to open my life up to that. God, that is an unreasonable request. Well, I want to tell you, God is going to keep asking. He's going to keep asking unreasonably of you. He's going to keep asking you to give when you think you can't, to serve when you think you're done, to trust when you think you can't trust again. God will keep asking. God can talk to you about anything at any time. And he can ask you something that you may say, no, God, I feel that was the right thing to do. And God goes, you know what? I want to turn this around. I have something greater and something better I want to do in your life. Why does God ask so unreasonably? Why does he do it? The first reason is this. The unreasonable is not about your capacity or your ability, but about your availability. God is much more interested, are you available, than if you can do it. God can always find someone to do it. He wants to know, are you available to him? Sometimes the request is asked purely to knock you off balance and ask the questions of yourself. God, would I do that if you asked me to? Would I step out like that? Would I trust you like that? Would I believe like that if you asked me to do it? Dave and Anne, if you don't know them, are sat over here on the front row. And somewhere in their late 50s, God spoke about going to Hungary. Learn another language, moving to another part of the world. Grown-up children at that point, secure in terms of job, in terms of future. And God made an absolutely unreasonable request. Go and learn another language and then move to another country and serve. Would you be prepared to lift it up and just step into something new when God comes along and makes the challenge? He makes an unreasonable request of you. God's not checking if you can do it. Usually if the request is unreasonable, you can't. But that's okay. That wasn't God's purpose, to see if you had the ability. His purpose was to see if you were available. So I want to ask you this morning, can you make yourself available to God? Can you position yourself to say, God, I don't think I can do it. In fact, I don't even know how to do it, but I'm prepared to trust you in the middle of it. When we bought this building, I did a lot of the work in buying the building. I'd never bought a building before outside of, I bought a house. But I'd never got into negotiating for this kind of thing. And this is what I discovered. People who sell buildings and solicitors, they have a different language to normal people. And the reason they have that language is to confuse normal people. There's no other reason that I could work out. And I had to sit in meetings, and I had to sit there and go, they talk about things, and I go, excuse me. what does that word mean? And I'd feel like an absolute tool sat there. I'm like, excuse me. I'd even put my hand up in meetings. Excuse me. What does that word mean? It means this. Well, why didn't you say that? Well, we did. Well, why didn't you say it in plain English? Well, we did. It's not your fault. What do you mean it's not my fault? They use language that you don't get. We had an occasion, maybe 3 years ago now, where I got a phone call early hours of the morning to tell me the building has burnt down. The church, I got the phone call that said this, the church building has burnt down. It was a Monday, early hours of Monday morning, and I'm sat in my bed and I'm thinking to myself that this building has burnt down. And I'm thinking, oh boy, well, Sunday's just gone. That's good. We've got 6 days to rebuild it. That's never going to happen. Damn it. I've got a conference in here on Tuesday. There's 1,000 people coming on Tuesday. That's never going to happen. And all this stuff's running through my mind. I'm thinking, this is absolutely crazy. This is absolutely ridiculous. And then the guy says, yeah, the building on Oldham Road has burnt down up in Failsworth. I didn't even trust myself to speak to the person on the other end of the phone. They had led me to believe this building had burnt down. I was slightly cross. So, you want to slam the phone, but when it's a mobile, you can't slam a mobile. It takes all the fun out of it, doesn't it? It's not got the same poignancy, has it? You have to turn it off and then slam it. Then you break it. And you have to blame the dog. I had to learn another set of language with these insurance guys who were like talking about, all this. And I'm like, I kept going, excuse me, I'm really sorry. I said, do you know solicitors? Because you and them, you would get on really well. And I'm saying, God, I don't have the skills for this. And God's going, don't care about your skill set. Because your skill set, in comparison to my skill set, is pretty lacking. But are you available? Because God's much more interested in your availability than he is in your ability. The second thing about the unreasonable request is this, that God, in the unreasonable, it's not a question of what is against you, but who is for you. The question is not, why can't it happen, but who said it will happen? When the question arises that you try and answer the reasons why it can't happen, what it means is this, you've taken your eyes off the one who asked you. When God makes the asks, he actually asks us at the same time to keep our eyes upon him. When Jesus came to Peter in the middle of a storm, Jesus is walking on the water, and Peter says to him, if you tell me to come to you, I'll come. And Jesus says, come on then. And Peter gets out of the boat and walks on the water towards Jesus. As long as he kept his eyes on the one who asked him to do it, he stayed on the water. But the moment circumstance and reason and excuse got a hold of his mind, he lost track of what he was looking at and instead looked at what was going on around him. A lot of us live our lives like that. We look at our circumstances, we look at our reasons and we look at our excuses and we say, God, I can't do that because. And we don't just stop and go, if he asks me, he believes in me. Because God would not ask you unreasonably if he did not believe you were the right person to do it. Zechariah has had this most unreasonable ask made of him. Have a child in your later years. Now that you're, to use his phrase, well on in years, have a child. And that child, Zechariah, is not only the answer to your prayers, but he opens the door for Jesus, the Messiah, to come. And he'll be the answer to everybody's prayers. And Zechariah goes, really? There's something incredible about the unreasonable ask of God, and that it means he believes in you. God asks us to believe in him. But in his ask of us to believe in him, he demonstrates his belief in us. Third thing about the unreasonable ask is this. When God asks unreasonably, it releases the impossible. When God asks unreasonably, it releases the impossible. They couldn't have a child. They were well on in years. Elizabeth was barren. It was impossible. But because God asked, what was impossible became possible. Because God asked, what was never going to happen began to happen. Because God asked. There have been a few times in our lives where we've given away the contents of our bank account and just felt God spoke to us and did it. And so we've been in a place where we've really made big sacrifice financially. The other week we were teaching somewhere together, Julie and I, and halfway through the day that we were teaching, this guy comes up to me and he says, I'd really like to buy you and your wife a meal. I'm thinking, my first thought was, this is a little inconvenient. We're in the middle of a day teaching. I can't just go out for a meal. I want to, but I can't. He says, I'm going to give you some money for it. So I've learned over the years that the appropriate response to that is to say thank you. Not to go through that little guilt trip that you go through. No, you don't have to do that. No, really, you don't have to, are you sure? I've just decided, you know what? Thank you very much. So he gives me the money, I put it in my pocket, and we get on with the day. I have to confess to you, for the next half hour, I was aware of the money in my pocket, and I was thinking to myself, I wonder how much he's given me. Is this a meal at McDonald's, or is this a meal? Can I take my wife somewhere swanky, or is this going to have to be, is this Nando's? Are we heading to Nando's, or are we heading somewhere really good? I know some of you think Nando's is really good, but you'll grow up. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm sat there and I'm thinking, this is awesome. This is great. And God says to me, you're going to give that money away. I said, no, God. I've learned over the years that don't negotiate with God. I said, God, I'm not going to give that money away because you said to that man, give him that money so he can take his wife out for a meal. I am simply fulfilling what you said the first time. I felt I backed God into a corner and I felt pretty good at the position I found myself in. This is great. 24 hours later, the money's actually still in my pocket at that point. And I haven't particularly thought about it again. We'd driven home and Julie says, you got that money? I said, sure. She says, great, I've got to give it to someone. I'm like, God, I told you about this, God. I told you. You said this was money for me to take my wife out. But you've usurped me, God, and you've gone to my wife. I gave her the money. I said, all right, go for it. Why? Because I've learned, if it seems a little bit unreasonable, it means the impossible's on its way. So I'm prepared to live unreasonably. I'm unreasonably devoted to God. He is first in my life. I unreasonably love Him. I'll pursue Him above all other things. I'm unreasonably devoted to being a part of church. It's a decision I made a long time ago. I'm going to keep doing it. I'm unreasonable about doing that because I've realized every time that I am unreasonable with God, God starts to do the impossible. Every time I'm unreasonable with God, God starts to open doors and make things happen that just shouldn't happen. The moment we realize God's asking unreasonably, what He's actually doing is this. God is setting us up for the impossible. He's setting us up for the impossible, something that cannot be done. But God is preparing to do it. For some of you, God wants to make unreasonable asks of you today. It's all right, the offering's gone. You can relax. Some of you wants to make unreasonable asks of your lifestyle, how you live and what you do, how you spend your time, how you spend your money. He wants to make unreasonable asks for some of you of what you're going to do with the next years of your life, where He's going to speak to you about making a statement, a commitment with years of your life towards what He's asking you to do. For some of you, it's an unreasonable ask about a company He wants you to start or a job He wants you to step into. And you say things like this, I'm not qualified for this. God's not interested in your ability, He's interested in your availability. If God wants to position you there, He'll do the work and position you. You've just got to be open for it. That's the key thing. God's got some unreasonable asks to make about your family, where He's going to talk to some of you about forgiveness. He's going to ask you unreasonably this morning to forgive people that you feel you should never have to forgive because they did it all. And God says, let me be a little bit unreasonable. Because if you want the impossible in your family, then I'm going to ask you to do something completely unreasonable to release the impossible in your family. God is going to ask the unreasonable. Why can He do it? Because He asks the unreasonable of Himself. Book of John chapter 3 and verse 16 tells us that God so loved the world that He unreasonably gave His own Son, that believing in Jesus would transform our lives for eternity. And Jesus unreasonably died on the cross. He'd done nothing to deserve it. He had done nothing to deserve the punishment. He was innocent. But the Bible tells us that he took the sins of the world upon him. It was a completely unreasonable ask by his Father. Son, will you pay the price for everybody else's sin? And Jesus, realizing that doing the unreasonable would release the impossible, said, I will. And he took your sin and my sin so that in the impossible we could know God. God can ask us unreasonably because he asked himself.